You do not need more information. That's the first lie we have to break. Because look around. We are living in the most informed age in human history, and somehow also one of the most confused. We can access 1,000 opinions in 10 seconds, 1,000,000 facts in one afternoon. An endless river of headlines, clips, podcasts, posts, hot takes, debates, data, warnings, hacks, teachings, and truth. And yet people are still starving. Not for content, for clarity. Not for noise, for coherence. Not for more words, for something deeper, for contact. Because most of us are not living from wisdom. We are living from a mental filing cabinet. A label here, a memory there. A political category, a spiritual identity. A trauma response with better branding. We call that intelligence. It isn't. It's storage. And the ego loves storage. The ego has one job, labeling. It sees a forest and says trees. It sees the ocean and says water. It sees a human being and says mine. It sees a stranger and says threat. It sees silence and says boring. It sees mystery and says explain it fast so I can feel safe again. That is what the ego does. It reduces. It compresses. It files reality into manageable little boxes so the nervous system can pretend it's in control. But here is the cost. The moment you label something, you usually stop experiencing it. The word replaces the wonder. The category replaces the contact. The concept replaces the encounter. You no longer meet life. You reference it. And in a divided age, that is exactly how the soul falls asleep. Because once you stop experiencing reality directly, you become easy to program. You stop seeing people. You see teams. You stop hearing truth. You hear triggers. You stop meeting a moment. You compare it to your past. You stop entering the present. You drag your entire browser history into every sacred room life opens for you. That is the modern ache. Not that we know too little, that we know too much in the shallow way. We have information at our fingertips, but understanding is at an all-time low. We have language for everything, and intimacy with almost nothing. We can define healing, quote awakening, repost wisdom, memorize doctrine, debate consciousness, and still remain completely untouched by the thing itself. And that is where this ancient, strange, powerful word enters the conversation. Grok. A word made famous through science fiction. A Martian word. But more than a word, a doorway. To grok something is not to merely understand it. It is to absorb it so fully that the border between you and it begins to dissolve. Not intellectual agreement, not conceptual applause. Union. You do not just study the ocean, you get wet. You do not just analyze love, you become vulnerable enough to be changed by it. You do not just collect spiritual teachings like trophies on a shelf. You let one truth enter your bloodstream until it reorganizes the architecture of your life. That is grokking. And most people have never been taught the difference between knowing about a thing and being transformed by it. That difference is everything, because knowing can still be ego. The ego loves to sound awake. It loves the vocabulary of transcendence. It loves the aesthetics of wisdom. It loves saying, I already know that. But grokking is dangerous to the false self. Because grokking does not decorate the ego, it dissolves it. It is the difference between reading a map and walking the mountain. The difference between owning a cookbook and tasting the fire. The difference between saying, we are all one, and having your heart broken open. Enough to treat another person like that is actually true. And here is the promise of this video. By the end of this journey, you will understand why our age is not suffering from a lack of information, but from a collapse of direct perception, and how recovering the art of grokking may be one of the most radical spiritual acts available to us now. Because this is bigger than language, bigger than self-help, bigger than intellectual spirituality. This is about reclaiming your capacity to meet reality before your conditioning translates it, before your fear labels it, before your ego domesticates it. And there is a deeper twist here, because the very thing that helps us survive, naming, categorizing, organizing, controlling, may also be the thing blocking the doorway to presence, to love, to God, to truth, to the living intelligence beneath all appearances. So in this video, we are going to go beyond understanding, beyond opinion, beyond spiritual performance. We are going to enter the ancient art of direct knowing, the kind that cannot be faked, the kind that cannot be downloaded, the kind that changes how you see your pain, your relationships, your enemies, your identity, and even your own mind. Not tomorrow, now, because in 2026, knowing is cheap. Everybody knows. Everybody has an angle, Everybody has a framework. Everybody has a label. But very few people are still capable of standing before life without instantly shrinking it into a caption. That capacity is sacred. That capacity is power. And that is the value pillar of everything we are about to unfold. Not more information. Transformation. Not more labels. Direct contact. Not more spiritual entertainment. Embodied perception. So stay with me, because once you see the difference between understanding a truth and becoming one with it, you will never consume information the same way again. And more importantly, you may finally see why the divided world outside us is only a mirror of the unlived division within us. So let's define the word, not casually, not intellectually, not like another spiritual buzzword we hang on the wall and forget by morning. Grok, a strange word, a Martian word, made famous through stranger in a strange land. Its root sense is to drink, but not just to sip information. To take something in so completely that it enters your system, that it crosses the border between what I know and what I am, that it stops being external knowledge and becomes internal chemistry. That is the difference. You can understand fire intellectually. You can define combustion, explain heat, measure light, debate its properties. But if you place your hand near the flame, your body knows something the mind can never fake. That is grokking. You don't stand outside the experience and comment on it. You enter it, you absorb it, you let it alter your structure. The modern mind is trained to observe life from behind glass. We analyze, compare, categorize, screenshot, clip, react, label, archive. We become professional spectators of our own existence. And the ego loves that position. Because the observer self can keep pretending it is separate, safe, superior, untouched. It can study love without surrendering, study grief without feeling, study awakening without changing, study truth without paying the price truth demands. But grokking destroys that distance. Because to grok something is to let it pass through the gates of abstraction and enter the bloodstream. Not, I read about forgiveness. I became soft enough to forgive. Not, I understand impermanence. I stopped clinging to what was already leaving. Not, I believe all life is connected. I now move through the world as if every encounter is sacred. That is why grokking is not passive. It is an act of dissolution. The ego wants a telescope. Grokking throws you into the ocean. The ego wants a museum tour. Grokking hands you the paintbrush. The ego wants to stand at the edge of the mystery and write notes. Grokking says, drink. Drink the moment. Drink the contradiction. Drink the heartbreak. Drink the beauty. Drink the silence until it is no longer silence as a concept, but a living room inside your own soul. And this is the thesis we need to face with full force. In this era, grokking is the antidote to the ego. Because the ego survives through separation. It says, I am here. Life is over there. I am the thinker. Experience is the object. I am the knower. Truth is the thing I possess. But the deeper spiritual path has always whispered something else. You do not conquer life by standing outside it. You awaken by realizing you were never separate from it to begin with. And that transition, from observing life to being life, is where the real transformation begins. This is where spirituality stops being performance. Because let's be honest, a lot of what passes for awakening today is just refined observation. People can explain consciousness beautifully and still be ruled by resentment. They can quote non-duality and still live in constant inner conflict. They can speak about presence while being completely absent from their own marriages, children, bodies, and breath. I know this because I have lived versions of it too. I know what it is to collect wisdom like armor, to speak truths I had not fully embodied, to confuse resonance with realization, to feel the ego sneak into spiritual language and make a home there. That is why this matters. Because the ego does not mind your vocabulary. It minds your surrender. It does not mind that you say oneness. It minds the moment you stop using another human being as a projection screen for your wounds. It does not mind that you say presence. It minds the moment you actually become present enough to hear what life is trying to teach you without translating it into your old identity. It does not mind that you talk about awakening. It minds the moment awakening starts costing you your favorite illusions. That is grokking, not admiration of truth. Assimilation, not studying the sacred from a distance. Letting the sacred reorganize your nervous system. It is when wisdom is no longer something you visit. It becomes the atmosphere you breathe. And once that begins, something profound shifts. You stop asking, "What does this mean?" and start asking, "What is this transforming in me?" You stop treating life like a puzzle to solve and start meeting it like a presence to merge with. You stop hovering above experience and start letting experience initiate you. That is the medicine, because the divided age trains us to remain fragmented. Mind over body, image over essence, opinion over encounter, information over intimacy. But Grokking reverses the split. It reunites thought and being, knowledge and embodiment, perception and participation. It makes wisdom cellular. And that is why it threatens the ego so deeply, because the ego can survive borrowed knowledge. It cannot survive lived truth. So the real question is not whether you understand the path. The real question is this: what truths have you allowed to become your chemistry? What have you merely repeated? And what have you actually drunk? Because the future will not be shaped by those who know the most. It will be shaped by those who have become coherent enough to embody what they know. That is grokking. And in the next movement, we need to go even deeper, because once you understand this, the real confrontation begins. Why the ego is so addicted to labels, distance, and control, and why most of humanity would rather explain life than actually dissolve into it. Now we arrive at the real battlefield, not out there, in here, because the deepest trap of the ego is not evil, it is distance. The ego survives by standing apart from life and naming what it sees. It looks at a flower and says, "flower," and the moment that label lands, the encounter is over. Not because the flower disappeared, because presence did. The mystery was reduced to a word. The living thing was compressed into a category, and the mind, satisfied with its label, moves on. That is what most people call knowing. But let's be honest. That is not knowing in any sacred sense. That is recognition. That is memory. That is mental shorthand. Useful? Yes. Necessary in daily life? Often. But awakening does not begin where labels multiply. It begins where labels lose their throne. Because the ego is a machine of naming. It says, "This is a flower. This is my partner. This is my pain. This is my enemy. This is success. This is failure. This is who I am. This is who I will never be." And once it labels, it freezes. It does not want to meet life as it is. It wants to manage life through concepts. That is why the ego is addicted to the illusion of knowledge. Because if I can name it, I do not have to surrender to it. If I can define it, I do not have to feel it. If I can analyze it, I do not have to be changed by it. You stop relating to life as dead material. You start encountering it as living intelligence. And this changes everything. It changes how you meet beauty. Because beauty is no longer something you rate. It becomes something you receive. It changes how you meet suffering. Because suffering is no longer just a concept to explain. It becomes a messenger to listen to. It changes how you meet other people, because they are no longer fixed characters inside your mental story. They become mysteries again. And maybe most importantly, it changes how you meet yourself. Because the ego labels the self the same way it labels the world. I'm this kind of person. I always do this. I'll never change. This is just how I am. But awakening breaks that spell. It reveals that what you call yourself is often just accumulated language. Old labels, old wounds, old defenses, old scripts rehearsed so many times they begin to feel like identity. And once you see that, a door opens. Because if the labeled self is not the whole truth, then transformation is not only possible, it is natural. This is why the knowing trap is so dangerous. It gives you the comfort of closure without the power of transformation. You think because you have named your wound, you have healed it. You think because you understand your pattern, you have transcended it. You think because you can talk about presence, you are present. But awakening asks a harsher question, not, can you explain it? But can you remain with it long enough for the distance to dissolve? Can you look at a flower until it is no longer flower, but a living eruption of being? Can you sit with grief until it is no longer my pain, but a sacred fire moving through the body? Can you meet another person without immediately reducing them to your history, your fears, your preferences, your labels? That is the work. And I say this as someone still walking it, because the ego is not a villain we kill once. It is a pattern we keep catching, a reflex, a narrator, a persistent roommate that keeps trying to put sticky notes on the face of God. But the more we see it, the less we obey it. And little by little, a new way of seeing emerges. A way of seeing before the label, before the split, before the mind rushes in to dominate the moment. That is awakening, not becoming superhuman, becoming intimate with reality again. So the next time you think you know something, pause. Ask yourself, do I know this, or have I only named it? Because one keeps you separate. The other changes your life. So now the question becomes practical. How do we live this? How do we find what is real in 2026, inside a world flooded with digital echoes, AI-generated noise, algorithmic emotions, borrowed opinions, synthetic certainty, and endless simulations of meaning? Simple. We stop chasing truth as an idea and start grokking the now. Because the present moment is the one place the ego cannot fully dominate unless we abandon it. The ego needs time distortion to survive. It feeds on yesterday's regrets. It feeds on tomorrow's anxieties. It feeds on replay, projection, comparison, fantasy, dread. It wants your consciousness anywhere but here, because here is where its spell weakens. The present moment is dangerous to the false self. In the present moment, you are not your storyline. You are not your resume. You are not your wound archive. You are not your imagined future collapse. You are not the character your fear keeps auditioning for. You are simply here, breathing, sensing, meeting what is. And that sounds small until you realize how few people actually do it. Most people do not live in the moment. They live in commentary about the moment. They do not feel the day. They filter it. Through memory, through fear, through desire, through self-image, through the ghost voices of people who hurt them, through the pressure of who they think they should already be by now. So they never actually touch life. They touch their interpretation of life. That is why presence is not a luxury anymore. It is spiritual survival. To grok a moment is to stop forcing it to resemble your past, to stop interrogating it with the anxieties of the future, to stop demanding that it becomes something else before you allow yourself to be inside it. It is to meet the moment raw, without yesterday's regret sitting in the passenger seat, without tomorrow's fear gripping the wheel, without the ego narrating every sensation into a problem, a threat, or a performance. This is not passivity, this is precision. Because when you finally meet the now directly, you begin to see what is actually here, instead of what your conditioning keeps projecting onto it. And here is where the practice becomes deeply personal. To grok the present moment does not mean the moment must feel good. This is where people get confused. They think presence means peace, calm, soft music in the background, a spiritual aesthetic. No, real presence can be peaceful, but it can also be painful. Sometimes to grok the moment is to feel the grief you have been outrunning, to notice the tension in your chest you kept calling normal, to admit the exhaustion, the resentment, the loneliness, the fear, the truth you kept postponing because your identity was not ready to hear it. That is still presence. In fact, that is often the doorway. Because the moment you fully grok your current state, even if it is painful, something profound happens. Resistance begins to disappear. Not because the pain vanishes instantly, but because the war against the pain softens, and that war is where the ego hides. The ego says, this should not be happening. I should be further along. I should be more healed. I should not feel this again. This feeling is proof that I'm broken. This moment is wrong. And that resistance multiplies suffering. Pain may be one wave. Resistance turns it into a storm. But when you grok your current state, when you stop labeling it as failure, stop dramatizing it into identity, stop running from it, stop decorating it with story, you create space. And in that space, the awakened self begins to emerge. Not the performative self, not the curated spiritual self, the deeper self, the self that can witness without collapsing, the self that can feel without becoming enslaved, the self that does not need to manipulate every moment in order to survive it. That self has always been there. But the ego is loud, and resistance is one of its favorite microphones, so the practical path is not complicated. It is radical, but it is not complicated. Pause, notice, breathe, feel, stay, not with the story, with the sensation, with the living texture of the moment. What is here in the body? What is here in the breath? What is here beneath the label? What remains when I stop arguing with reality for 10 sacred seconds? That is practice. That is how we reclaim truth in an age of imitation. not by becoming more informed than the machine, but by becoming more present than the machine can ever be. Because an algorithm can predict behavior, it cannot inhabit being. A model can generate language. It cannot directly taste the holiness of this breath, this ache, this silence, this rising sun on your skin, this trembling in your chest when life is asking you to stop pretending. Only consciousness can do that. Only a living soul can grok the now, and the more deeply you do, the less the ego can steer your life through panic, projection, and repetition. Because without resistance, its grip weakens. Without resistance, the old identity loses momentum. Without resistance, you stop feeding the false self with the friction it needs to feel important. And then something shifts. The awakened self takes the wheel, not as an idea, as a state, clearer, softer, less reactive, more intimate with reality, more available to truth. So if you want to begin today, begin here. Do not try to fix the moment. Do not rush to explain it. Do not ask how to escape it. Grok it. Drink it fully. Even this, especially this. Because the present moment is not an obstacle on the path, it is the path. And once you learn to enter it without resistance, you are no longer just thinking about awakening, you are becoming it. So why is this word resurfacing now? Why this term? Why this idea? Why in this exact moment of history? Because technology is getting better and better at mimicking the outer shell of intelligence. It can process faster, summarize faster, predict faster, generate faster. It can simulate logic, pattern recognition, language, even the tone of wisdom. But imitation is not incarnation, and that distinction is everything. Because the deeper the machine moves into logic, the more the human is being called into something else, not less intelligence, a deeper intelligence. Not just analysis, integration, not just processing, presence, not just information, felt reality. This is the human competitive advantage in a divided age. We can grok, we can feel truth, not just describe it. We can enter meaning, not just generate sentences about meaning. We can let an experience penetrate us deeply enough that it changes our chemistry, our choices, our relationships, our nervous system, our way of seeing. A machine can model grief. It cannot mourn. A machine can define love. It cannot tremble in the risk of giving itself away. A machine can simulate awakening language. It cannot kneel in the fire of an actual inner death. That is why this matters now. Because as the world becomes more synthetic, your task is not to compete with the machine at its own game. Your task is to become more fully human, more present, more embodied, more intuitive, more coherent, more capable of direct encounter. That is the shift. For years, people were rewarded for intellectual hoarding. Read more, save more, watch more, bookmark more, collect frameworks, collect teachings, collect insights you never embody. But let's tell the truth. Reading 100 books on spirituality while remaining trapped in the same reactive loops is not wisdom. It is spiritual storage. And grokking breaks that spell. Because grokking moves you away from intellectual hoarding and into experiential integration. It asks a brutal but liberating question. What truth are you actually living? Not what truth do you admire? Not what truth do you repost? Not what truth do you understand in theory? What truth has entered your reflexes? Your tone of voice? Your relationships? Your response to pain? Your ability to remain open when life does not obey your script? That is the first gift of grokking, clarity. Because clarity is not having more ideas in your head. Clarity is when one real principle enters your life so deeply that confusion starts to lose oxygen. You do not need 10,000 teachings. You need one truth embodied. Maybe it is, do not resist the moment. Maybe it is, what I judge I have not yet understood. Maybe it is, presence is greater than performance. Maybe it is, my peace cannot depend on conditions. When you grok even one of those, not as poetry, but as practice, your life starts reorganizing itself around what is real. And that creates a kind of clarity no algorithm can hand you. The second gift is just as immediate, stress reduction. Because grokking implies acceptance, not resignation, not passivity. Acceptance. And acceptance is different. Acceptance says, this is what is here. This is what I am feeling. This is what this moment contains. I do not need to love it, but I will stop wasting life fighting the fact that it exists. That alone changes the nervous system. Because most stress is not born only from circumstance. It is born from friction with circumstance, from inner argument, from resistance, from the ego screaming that the now should be different before it will allow us to breathe. But the moment you drink the present moment fully, without denial, without dramatization, without the endless inner lawsuit against reality, something softens. The body stops bracing. The mind stops splintering. The energy trapped in resistance begins to return as awareness. And awareness is lighter than control. This is why grokking can feel like exhaling after years of clenching. You are no longer using your life force to fight what has already arrived. You are using it to meet what is actually here. That is freedom. And then there is the third gift, maybe the most urgently needed of all, connection. Because to grok another person is one of the highest forms of communication. Not to categorize them, not to diagnose them in 5 seconds, not to reduce them to politics, personality type, trauma language, or your past experience with someone similar. To truly grok another person is to listen until the wall between your certainty and their reality becomes thin. It is to feel beneath their words, to sense the wound beneath the posture, to meet the human beneath the performance. That is empathy in its mature form, not sentimental agreement. Sacred contact. And imagine what that changes. Imagine relationships where people are not just reacting to labels, but actually encountering each other. Imagine families where being understood matters more than being right. Imagine communities where listening is deeper than branding. Imagine a world where communication is not the exchange of positions, but the meeting of living souls. This is why grokking is not just a private mystical tool, it is a civilizational necessity. Because the divided age trains us to skim each other, to summarize each other, to weaponize fragments of each other. But grokking restores depth. It says, slow down, enter the experience, feel the reality. Do not just know about the person. Do not just know about the pain. Do not just know about the teaching. Become intimate enough with it that separation loses some of its illusion. That is the human edge. Not speed, depth, not volume, resonance, not the ability to produce more outputs. The ability to be transformed by contact. And the people who will remain most powerful in the years ahead will not be those who merely consume the most information. They will be those who can still feel, still discern, still embody, still perceive what is real beneath the noise, still enter a moment, a truth, a person, a pain, a calling, and let it become part of their living chemistry. That is grokking, and that is why it matters now more than ever. Because when the world becomes increasingly artificial, the awakened human must become increasingly authentic, not louder, truer, not more reactive, more rooted, not more informed alone, more integrated. So the real invitation of this age is not, can you keep up? It is, can you remain human enough to feel what is real? While the whole world is trying to hand you simulations instead, that is the challenge, and that is the advantage. So here is the final truth. Do not just analyze your life. Do not just study your wounds. Do not just think about your calling. Do not just make vision boards for a future your nervous system still does not trust. Drink it in. Drink the lesson. Drink the silence. Drink the responsibility. Drink the fear until it turns into fuel. Drink the moment until it is no longer a moment, but a doorway. Because your life will not change the day you collect better ideas. It will change the day a truth enters you so deeply. You cannot go back to who you were before it touched your chemistry. That is the shift. That is the crossing. That is the difference between spiritual entertainment and awakening. So stop standing outside your own existence like a commentator. Stop reviewing your destiny from a safe distance. Stop orbiting the life you were meant to enter. Step in. Become the prayer. Become the discipline. Become the clarity. Become the love you keep waiting to feel. Become the future you keep asking the universe to send. Because the awakened life is not built by observation. It is built by union. And maybe that is what this whole journey was trying to remind us. That to grok is not merely to understand, it is to merge, to dissolve the distance, to let truth pass through language and become being. To grok is to love. To grok is to touch the divine. To grok is to be truly, finally awake. So here is my invitation to you. For the next 24 hours, do not just name your life, meet it. Do not just label the flower, see it. Do not just describe the pain, feel what it is teaching. Do not just think about your purpose. Take one step that proves you are ready to embody it. And if this message found you at the right moment, write "I choose to grok" in the comments, not as a slogan, as a declaration. Because in an age of noise, to become real is rebellion. In an age of simulation, to become present is power. And in an age of endless understanding, to finally become what you know, that is liberation. I'll see you in the next one. Until next time, Universal Consciousness, signing out.